starte det her. Ja. Hello everybody, welcome to the first Periscope Q&A session, this time about roasting. I hope that we have some loggers on, and we're going to talk about roasting today. I'll show you the actual roaster that we use in our store at the end of the session, so that you have a little glimpse of what we actually use when we roast our coffee and how we actually use it. We are playing a little bit with airflow these days. We're also playing a little bit with new curves. I've been researching the whole last year. We're actually testing a lot of Scott Rao's, or Scott Rao, that's how we say it, I think. Scott Rao's theories about the rate of rise curves and how they should look like and so on. We ended up actually not following his theories 100%, but I did learn a lot from reading the book that he wrote. The book is called Coffee Roasting, I think, written by Scott Rao. So if you're interested in learning more about roasting, you should definitely read that book and give it a thought. The most important thing, I think, is when you roast is that you actually test your own roaster. Every roaster that I've been roasting on is different, whether it's the same machine just set up in different places or different machines. They all act very differently. It can be the same brand. The drum thickness might be a little bit different. The airflow setup will for sure definitely be different. And also where the probes are, the thermometer probes, where they're placed, will give you a huge variance in how the temperature reads and what temperature we're reading. So our probe is actually fixed on the faceplate and very close to it. So if you can see my finger, it only goes a little bit in, whereas the normal probe will go very far in. So we are actually getting a lot of the faceplate temperature while we're roasting. And everyone tells me, why don't you change it so you get more accurate reading? Well, I don't really need to know exactly what the temperature is when I'm roasting. I just need to measure some temperature that is consistent, so that you can actually replicate the curve more easily with the logging software you're using. So, do we have any questions, Mats?
Yeah, Kaya asked, where did you buy this shirt?
So Kaya asked me where I bought this shirt. I actually didn't buy this shirt. It was a sample that I got for a work shirt from Albam in London. Thank you, Kaya, for asking and noticing. I don't think we have any roast questions. Okay, a lot of people ask me these questions, when we talk about light roast, everyone thinks that the lighter the better, or that I only can drink light roasted coffee. For me, it's actually not a thing about whether to be light or dark. It's about developing the coffee's potential in flavor. A lot of times I feel when I taste coffee that you actually taste more like a defect in the roasting process, and it can actually be too light. Like you'll get this kind of malty flavor that for some people tastes like tobacco or wheat or cereal or like yellow peas, dried peas, and that's a sign of a coffee being under roasted. And sure, last year for sure we had some trouble with that. We managed to fix that problem actually with playing a little bit around with the airflow. So we noticed that lower density coffees needed a little bit lower airflow than higher density coffees, and so on. And this is all related to getting the moisture out from the beans while you're roasting. Also, if you're using too high of a temperature, especially in the beginning and also towards the end of the roast, you can very easily scorch the beans without actually noticing scorching. Scorching meaning you're getting like black spots on the beans. But scorching is more than that. For me, it's about the bean being too roasted on the outside and not developed on the inside. So you'll have like a hint of green coffee still in the middle of the bean, and the bean will look roasted, but you will still taste that sort of green coffee flavor. And that's not a desirable flavor. So we actually managed to fix that by raising the airflow on higher density coffees and lowering it on lower density coffees. And the problem actually occurred again, because this was when during summer we were testing this, and then we got the same problem once it got cold here in Norway. It was like minus 20 degrees outside. And I talked to George Howell about this. Many of you know George Howell, the legend in the US. And he said that by raising the airflow during winter, you would actually get rid of this problem. So I tested that and it actually worked. Very contrary to what I believed, but it actually helped a lot. So with different airflows, you can definitely develop the bean more or less. It's a matter of finding that balance so that you're not roasting it too fast, not too slow, and also developing the bean from the inside and out so that the bean is very evenly roasted and you have full development. I know we have some questions now, Mats.
Yeah, now we do.
What's the first one?
John asked something like, what do you think of Matt Perger's barista hustle? And I didn't read like the last end before it disappeared.
So John asked me what I think about Matt Perger's barista hustle. Well, I'm actually following it. I read it every time I get the email. I don't necessarily agree with everything that's written there, but I think that's a healthy thing in coffee, that one person's opinion might not be the law. It is an opinion. It's not necessarily a fact or a researched fact that is written in concrete. So for my last 17 years in coffee, I've been reading a lot of blogs and a lot of forums and a lot of books, and what was true yesterday might not be true today. If you read my book, there are some things there that I would have changed if I rewrote it right now, but I think be critical when you read any unscientific paper, but also scientific papers in coffee, because it's very difficult to think of every single factor that affects quality of coffee when you write on a subject. I do think Matt is doing a great job. He has definitely been a huge part of raising the awareness of the importance of extraction and so on. That is also related to roasting. We're actually using a refractometer, which Matt is pushing very hard that everyone should use, and I agree. We're using it to measure development in roast. So for instance, if you have the same coffee roasted in two very different ways, normally, not always, but normally, the more developed coffee will have a higher extraction than the less developed coffee. But for me, flavor is more important. I've also seen coffees with higher extraction percent that are still tasting underdeveloped, more underdeveloped than a coffee that has a lower extraction percent. So it's a tool that you can use, but don't trust any tool 100% because you can be fooled by it. Next question?
Yeah. Albane asked, does the ROR have to be decreasing during the roast?
So Scott Rowe's theory is that the rate of rise curve. Rate of rise is how fast the temperature is rising at any given point, and normally it's measured. The curve is measured so that you get a number every 30 seconds or 10 seconds or so on, something. So it just tells you the speed of the roast, of how fast the temperature is rising. Scott Rowe's theory is that the rate of rise curve should be at its highest in the beginning. Of course, it will go down because you're not able to increase the rate of rise as much throughout the whole roast. But how the rate of rise curve should look like really depends on your coffee, your roaster, your airflow setup, and also your personal preference in how the coffee is going to taste. I don't think there's a one rule that the coffee should be roasted like this. We need to have acceptance for people's preference. Some people like a little bit more roasty flavors. Some people like underdeveloped flavors. That should be okay. I think on my roaster, the rate of rise curve is definitely highest in the beginning, but it'll take some time for us to start to add heat. We try to add the most amount of heat in the beginning of roast throughout the whole last year, and what we saw was that we were getting darker coffees still tasting underdeveloped. So we were always focusing too much at the end of the curve and not enough on the beginning of the curve. And it depends on how your drum is set up and so on, but how thick it is. And we never had any problems with scorching, in my opinion, but underdevelopedness can happen in the beginning of the roast and also the end of the roast. At the end, you normally see a dip. So when you hit first crack, there's a lot of energy created inside the beans, and that makes the temperature go up a lot faster. So we normally would lower the heat either right before first crack or right after, depending on the coffee, and then you'll see a decrease in the rate of rise curve for sure. And some people say if it goes up again, then you will underdevelop your coffee. But in my experience, that's not always the case. It might also be other factors. So getting to know your roaster is I think, the most important. But we do look a lot more on the rate of rise curve than we did before now. But I'm also looking at the temperature curve and, most importantly, tasting and measuring my coffee afterwards. Any new questions?
Yeah, so Eric asked, how do you define the ROR curve? But you probably defined it already.
I define the rate of rise curve as how fast the temperature is rising at any given point. And of course, the way you look at that curve, you can set it to give you a number every 10 seconds, 30 seconds, every second, and so on. Depends how stable the curve you want, because it can go up and down. I think our setup is like every 20 seconds while we're roasting, so we get a little bit more even curve to look at. Otherwise, we just get confused. And these curves are shown in Cropster, which is our logging program that we use here when we roast. There are also other softwares you can use. I know there's a free one. I can't remember the name, but I think there's a rate of rise curve on that as well. I think it was Ed Bourgeois. I don't know how to pronounce his last name. Brilliant guy that is very much into farming. He has actually led me into learning a lot more about farming for the last year than I've ever known. But he is also a coffee geek and was one of the first ones to talk about the rate of rise curve and implementing it while roasting. All right.
Yeah, so someone called It's the Limit. They asked, is it easier to roast dark?
Is it easier to roast dark? Well, I would say that if you prefer a very dark coffee, it doesn't really matter the curve. It will still taste very roasty. It's easier to cover bad coffee with a dark roast. I wouldn't say it's necessarily easier because, 5 years ago or 3 years ago, we were also roasting darker than we are doing now. And we were still sort of perfecting the curve. So it depends really how you define dark, whether it's like French roast Starbucks dark, where I think, anyone can probably make a coffee taste bitter by doing that. So yeah, that's a little bit easier. A lot of people say, is it easy to roast light, or it's easier to roast light and sort of make it more likable? I would say the opposite. It's very, very difficult to roast light and still develop the coffee fully, so you have a sweet cup without the sourness from underdeveloping the coffee and so on. Also, you really need to buy the best possible quality green coffee, and you'll taste a mistake in the green coffee much more easily if you roast it lighter rather than if you roast it extremely dark. I think the two extremes are there, but there's a lot in between that we're never talking about. I can easily enjoy, especially on a Kenyan coffee, I can easily enjoy coffee that is a little bit more developed or roasted a little bit darker than we do, because you get this sort of blackcurrant flavor that is very pleasant. I just have problems with bitterness in the finish, so that's why I personally don't prefer to roast that way. But I can easily enjoy a cup of especially Kenyan coffee or even Ethiopian that is roasted slightly darker, because you get a different aroma and flavor picture, and that is also very interesting.
Yeah.
Next one.
So Nelson asked, any tips for roasting natural Brazils? I find them sensitive.
Roasting natural Brazils. It's actually been a long time since I did it, and to be honest, I've never been very good at it. It's a low density coffee. My friend in Brazil called Felipe Croce, or I think that's how you pronounce it, he is the farmer of Fazenda Ambiental Fortaleza. He is very good at roasting fully developed Brazils, even if it's washed or natural, without, in my opinion, over roasting it. He still has a sweet and bright coffee without having the bitterness from over roasting. He normally uses a lot more conductivity in the beginning in the roaster. That means less airflow. And he's also playing a little bit with drum speed, so slowing it down so that the beans actually have a little bit more conductive heat. And then increases the airflow during the roast. That has worked very well for him. For me, roasting with higher airflow throughout the roast has not been a very good success. So last year we actually tested going quite far down with the airflow until the roaster overheated and caught fire almost. I wouldn't recommend that, but you can use the hatch on the pipe of the airflow on the roaster, or if you have a variable frequency drive where you can adjust the fan speed of the cyclone. I would recommend trying at least to go down on the airflow, because you're roasting a lower density coffee that needs a little bit less airflow to get dried. Hope that helped a little bit. All right, next one.
Yeah, so New Sweden Coffee asks something. Are there coffee origins that don't take well, like Scandinavian roast profiles? Maybe hard to work with, or?
That's a good question. Are there any origins that doesn't roast well in the Scandinavian style, whatever that means? I was doing this. First of all, Scandinavian style of roasting can be anything. You can get really dark roast here in Scandinavia, and you can get very light roast, so and anything in between as well. But I would say that it's not the origin that defines whether a coffee is able to be roasted light or even dark. It's the actual coffee quality, and you have great qualities in any country, hopefully, and also the worst quality. So in my experience, you just need to have very, very good quality ingredients in order to be able to roast light and get a pleasant cup out of that. Having said that, I haven't really had any great experience roasting Robusta in a light way. It tends to enjoy a darker roast, and even then it doesn't really taste good. But for me, the coffee doesn't really know its political boundary, so it doesn't really matter where it's grown. It's a matter of the variety and the growing conditions where it is, in order to define the quality of it. And if it's good quality, it's always good quality. You might not like the flavor, but you can define it as good quality. All right.
Yeah, so Café Don Ruiz, how do beans react with high versus low airflow?
Ooh, that's a very good thing to talk about. So I mentioned that I last year experienced with changing the airflow during roast, and we actually use a variable frequency drive to adjust the fan speed of our cyclone, and the cyclone makes the underpressure in the roaster that draws the air into the roaster. So we can actually vary the speed of the air going through the coffee while it's roasted. I noticed that with a too low airflow, you would very often get a very pleasant mouthfeel. Like it would be a very thick mouthfeel that feels like sweetness, but it's not necessarily the case. It can be like a thick mouthfeel, and you'll still have an underdeveloped coffee flavor, like green peas or something. Very easy to be fooled by this sensation, because it's somewhat pleasant to have in the mouth. I think if you have too high of an airflow, the coffee very often tastes a little hollow and baked. And my friend Willie at Heart Roasters mentioned to me once, when I was roasting with much higher airflow, that my coffee tastes stripped from aromas, like it's been dried out of the coffee. And when I tasted it next to a coffee that was with lower airflow, you could easily understand what he meant. It feels like the coffee has been robbed of flavors, and you don't have the the mouthfeel anymore. You don't have the sweetness. You just have like bitter flavors and yeah, a little hollow, I would say. That's the best way I can describe it. A little dry and so on. So finding that balance in your roaster is key, but it's not just about the roaster, it's about the coffee as well. We have discovered that we do prefer different airflows for different coffees. Only slightly, but still there is a big difference in how the coffees will be roasted with different airflows. All right, next one.
Yeah, Happy Espresso. They asked 2 questions.
Yeah.
How do you get rid of the vegetable note in light roasting? And what's your definition of developed coffee in quotation marks?
All right, developed coffee for me is a coffee that does not have the vegetal or hay-like notes that you get from underdeveloped coffee. So if you want to taste a very underdeveloped coffee, just stop the roast before first crack and you will taste how that tastes like. And if you have any hints of that in the coffee, then in my opinion you have an underdeveloped coffee. I think a developed coffee should have as much sweetness as possible without having any dominant bitter flavors from charring or burning the coffee. But my threshold is probably different than your threshold, so that's how we do different things when we roast, and because we want to reflect our personal tastes. What was the first question? How do I define underdevelopedness? Or how do I get rid of the underdeveloped coffee flavor?
Or the vegetable note.
Yeah, the vegetable note.
Hard work.
Well, if I knew the one answer to that, I would be a very happy guy. This is what we struggle with every day, because we are riding the border of going too light all the time. So, of course, we measure color, we measure the weight or the density of the coffee before and after roast. But for me, it's about finding the right amount of heat and the airflow that you need to apply, especially in the beginning, and also at the end, that you don't speed up the roast too much after first crack. Like, let it develop during the crack. So we normally go down on the flame and the heat, either right before or during, or like right after the crack has started, to let the coffee create its own energy and sort of develop without speeding it up too much. When we talk about roast times, I find that especially on a drum roaster, and this is different if you have a Loring Smart Roast or something where you're roasting with a lot more airflow. If you have a drum roaster, especially on my Probat, if I roast the coffees faster than 8 minutes, you will for sure have this underdevelopedness, because the coffee's roasted way too much on the surface and not on the inside, and that's where you get the vegetal notes from the inside. But also, if you roast it too slow, you will have like a very dry and bitter coffee that can still have this underdeveloped coffee. So it's really a matter of finding the balance of time, temperature, and airflow in your roaster. I can't really tell you exactly what to do, because it's different from roaster to roaster. You just got to try different profiles and then taste the results. All right?
Yeah. So someone called Eric, he asked, when you have a new crop, what substances do you consider?
I'm not sure I understand the question. When I have a new...
Which substances? But maybe he could ask the question again.
Eric, you're talking about new crops, and what substances do you consider? I'm not sure what you mean by substances. So let's move on to the next question. If he asks again, we can write it down.
Yeah. So I didn't get his name, but how do roasters approach, the approach to the crack affect acidity? Approach to the crack affect acidity.
Affecting acidity during roast. Well, this is... I cannot speak in a scientific way here, because I don't really know the research on acidity and roasting in full. I know that you degrade some acidic compounds during roasting, and some of them actually increase as well. But by experience of flavor, I think if you are having a very fast roast, and you can easily get a very astringent finish, and that's related to acidity. But you can also get this astringency if your roast is too slow. I think finding the balance between acidity and sweetness, and that's what I mean by fully developed, that I prefer a very acidic coffee, but the acidity needs to be balanced with sweetness. And of course, that all depends on extraction and so on during brewing, but it's also related to roasting. So the more you roast, of course, the acidity perception will go down because there's less acidity in the coffee. The lighter the roast, the higher acidity, but you need to sort of balance it with sweetness. So how I approach it when I roast, well, normally when I get a new coffee, I'm not a guy with a lot of theory. So normally we just test different profiles. We'll test maybe 5, 6, 7 different profiles if it's a new coffee, and then we'll taste the coffees next to each other. And I normally use like a very dark coffee or a very light coffee to compare with, just to see where in the range we are. And if I notice some astringency, normally we will have to roast slightly slower, and I'm talking like instead of 9 minutes 30 seconds, it's 10 minutes, and so on. And also if it's a little flat and bitter, we'll speed up the roast, so you don't get that kind of bitterness and astringency. So it's a little difficult to explain on a Periscope session. It's more easy to explain when you actually taste the roast. So my tip is to try the roasts. If you have a roaster, try the roasts a batch, same batch size, same coffee. Try to roast one for 8 minutes, 9 minutes, 10 minutes, 11 minutes, and so on, and taste the difference side by side. And also, once you've sort of done that, you can try to do a 10-minute roast in different ways. So with a lot of heat in the beginning and less at the end, and the opposite with less heat in the beginning and a lot at the end. And then you'll learn how your roaster works and what works for your coffee.
Yeah, so Eric is back.
Eric, thank you for getting back to us.
So what do you consider before roasting, like the density, moisture, and he would like the numbers?
So when I buy coffee, I normally always check the beans in several different ways. First of all, just I look at the beans. Of course, we roast them and taste the beans. I check the water activity. It needs to be within, I don't remember the numbers in my head. The moisture level, normally it should be between 10 and 11.5%. Over 12% you start getting trouble with fading. But I would say that for me, it's much more important to know how the coffee was harvested and processed and dried, and also stored and shipped. Meaning that reading a moisture percent doesn't really tell you anything how the coffee was dried. Looking at the bean can tell you something. If it's sort of uneven in color, it has some white spots, especially around the edges, it can tell you that the coffee was dried very fast with high temperatures, and that's not very good for the coffee's shelf life. So for me, the most important part of being able to roast great coffee is actually to QC, quality control, the coffee at farm level. So we've implemented slower drying techniques at the farms, better storage in grain pro bags instead of the normal nylon or jute bags. We try to ship the coffees more efficiently and so on. And that has helped us get more even coffee, and also coffee with longer shelf life, so it tastes fresh for a longer time. One of the things that I find really interesting that we have been doing for a couple of years now is to separate screen size whenever we can. So in Colombia, for instance, when we work with Finca Tamana, we ship the coffees in 2 different screen size. So the same lot of coffee, but we have 10 bags, for instance, of the smaller screen size, meaning the bean size is smaller, and 10 bags with the bigger screen size. So in relation to Kenya, it would be like buying the ABs and the double A's, and you roast them separately. Why we do this is because it doesn't cost us anything more to do it, because the screening is already being done at the mill. And I was screening the roasted coffee once all of them were mixed together, and the big beans were clearly underdeveloped and the small beans were clearly over roasted. So by separating them, you get a much more even roast. It's easier to replicate the roast from time to time, and the coffee just tastes more precise and better. So there's a lot of things we do when we buy coffee, and once I've done all this quality control, I sort of know how the coffee is and how it will react a little bit more than if I just started from scratch and just got a random sample. Of course, we've been buying the coffees from the same farmers for many years now, so you sort of get to know the coffees over time and what's the potential in the bean. But I would say get a water activity meter. I don't remember the numbers. It's quite expensive, but it can tell you a little bit of more than just the moisture content. Look at the beans. Use a UV light, for instance, and put the beans in a dark place with the UV light, and you'll clearly see if the coffee is evenly roasted or not. You'll see like white spots on the beans if it's not evenly dried. I mean, not roasted, dried. And the more even product you have before you roast it, the better you will be able to roast the coffee as well. I hope that answered your question. Any more?
Velo, they
Velo.
also had 2 questions. What do you do if you want balanced extraction and tons of sweetness without any roastness? And the like, if you compare T1 to T2.
I'm not sure what he means with T1 and T2, but if I want a balanced extraction and tons of sweetness without any roastness, well, if I knew the answer to that question, I would be a lucky man. For me, it's about testing, and tasting, because not only does your roast environment change all the time. We're roasting with a drum roaster that uses the ambient air to create the airflow, and the temperature of the ambient air will for sure define how much gas and flame you're using in order to reach a certain temperature. So the percentage of conductivity and convection is always a little bit different. Also, the coffee changes over time, so it's not a static product. It gets older and older. The temperature of the coffee will change before you start roasting and so on. So it's very difficult to say that if you do this, you'll get tons of sweetness and a good extraction. I would say that to get sweetness from coffee, you need to be able to extract as much as possible without getting the bitterness. The bitterness can come from roast. So let's say you're using an EK43 grinder, you should easily be able to extract between 21 and 22% easily without getting too much bitterness. If you do get a lot of bitterness and astringency at that percentage, try to fix your roast. Try to go slightly lighter. Try to use a little bit more heat in the beginning maybe, and try to roast maybe a little faster or even slower if that's the problem, if it's too fast. And you will be able to taste the coffee better. A good example is I was just in a coffee shop in Copenhagen, and the person said that he didn't like the EK extractions at espresso. And I also had a filter coffee in another shop where the coffee was extremely thin and under-extracted with an EK, which sort of it was a little strange to me. But I had the same coffee in a bag that I took home, and when I made a higher extraction, I could clearly taste a lot more bitterness. So I think people tend to under-extract their coffee if the coffee is not roasted well. If the coffee is bitter because of roast, you tend to under-extract because the bitterness is unpleasant. So when I do QC in my coffee lab, I normally do 2 extractions when I cup coffees. I do one with a normal Ditting 804 grinder that is extracted around 18%, and then I do a high extraction on an EK around 21.5% with the same coffee. And I taste them both because a lot of my customers will under-extract coffee and some of them will over-extract, but it gives me a better idea of how the coffee actually is roasted and how it's performing when you're brewing it and drinking it. And yeah, so that's my recommendation.
Yeah, so they also said like T1 equals T2 equals T3 equals, and like if you go past 100% you flatten the coffee. What's your thoughts? Like the same question. The one with the verses.
Oh yeah, so charge to yellow, yellow to crack, crack to finish. Okay, so again, well, this is a very good suggestion that you divide your roast curve into 3 parts or 4 parts. And here it's suggested that the first part is from when you charge the coffee into the drum until it's yellow, and when the beans are in the yellow stage. The second part being from yellow to the coffee starts cracking, and the third stage being from crack to finish. So I'll tell you what I'm doing on most of our coffees right now is we charge the coffee, let's say on 220 degrees. It doesn't really tell you anything because it depends on the probe placement. But let's say we charge on 220. We'll actually have to wait about a minute, maybe 30 seconds, maybe 1 minute and a half before we actually add a lot of heat. We just found that if we add too much heat right from the start, we do get a more astringency in the flavor, and the coffee tends to be slightly more underdeveloped. This is very contrary to what Scott Rao is preaching in his book, but you know, that's fine. My roaster works better this way in my experience, at least for my tastes. So after about a minute or something, we'll add a lot of heat. That's probably the maximum heat, and then we'll probably slowly decline it a little bit, but not much. We normally have quite a lot of heat until the first crack. And depends on the coffee. Sometimes we will turn down the heat right before first crack, meaning like 10 or 20 or 30 seconds. Or we might do it 10 or 20 seconds after the coffee starts cracking. From cracking till we dump the coffee, it depends on the coffee, but normally we're around 1 minute. So that's what you call development time. With espresso, we follow the same curve as filter coffee now. We just let it develop slightly more. And the reason being, espresso is a very concentrated drink. The acidity can be a little bit full on if you don't sort of develop it a little bit more. We try not to have too much bitterness in the espresso as well. So it's a different drink now than it was 4 years ago. All right.
Yeah. So David asked, how much do you experiment with total roast time?
With total roast time, actually, the coffee will sort of give you its roast time more or less where the frame is. So let's take a very good example, our Finca Tamana. We used to roast that very fast because the beans are very dense, it's shade dried, so they're very hard, but it never really worked well. So we were roasting around 10 minutes, we were constantly getting an underdeveloped flavor. So slowly increasing the roast time, and now we're I think about 11 minutes on that. That's actually one of our longest roasts. The coffee tastes a lot more developed and sweet without having that sort of sour and vegetal flavor. So it really depends on the coffee, but we're normally in the range of 9 minutes 30 to 11 minutes 30. It really depends on the coffee, and that's a huge range. If you had the same coffee and you tried those different times, you would have very, very different results. So I just recommend experimenting. How are we on time?
We have been like 38 minutes.
So we're a little bit over time. Do we have any more questions, or should we have a look at the roaster?
There are a few.
Okay, let's do it quick.
Do you roast decaf? That's day cat.
Unfortunately, decaf is not very popular in Norway, so, well, or is it fortunate? I don't know. But no, I've never actually roasted a batch of decaf coffee. So that's the answer to that.
Like a minimal degassing you would recommend for filter?
So degassing, well, that depends on the roast profile, your roaster, how you prefer the coffee. Personally, well, here in the bar we wait minimum 4 to 5 days before we use the coffee or serve it to our guests, just to get more clarity and get rid of that sort of initial sort of smoky flavor that you get. Personally, I prefer drinking coffee that has, above 9 days. So I normally take the bags that are standing on shelf a little bit longer, because I just find that you get a lot more clarity in the cup. But we nitrogen flush our bags and vacuum seal them. It really is different if you pack the coffee in different containers without flushing and so on. So it really depends on the coffee.
David asked, do you change based on barometric pressure?
I have not been researching barometric pressure, unfortunately. I think it has an impact on the roast for sure. I just don't know how to approach it. So if you have any good ideas, please message me on Twitter or something, so I can start looking into that. Yep.
Yeah, so like Tim asked the same name. Are espresso roast profiles more difficult, and do you cup espresso roast?
We started cupping espresso roast last year. I hated doing it before because we were roasting too dark for espresso, so it was a nightmare to cup. But now our roasts are not so different from our filter roast. I still think it's hard to quality control because if you brew it as espresso, it just gets so strong. So I prefer to cup them. I'm looking for a little bit more sweetness and slightly less acidity when I cup those coffees. But I need to figure out a better system to QC it, and because it takes a lot of time, and I also think we're not 100% happy with our espresso roast yet. We have gotten a lot better, in my opinion, at least for my preference. We have gotten a lot better the last year, and we changed it completely like 2 years ago. So we're still developing how to do it. But in terms of espresso, my biggest recommendation is you start using proper filter baskets like the VST filters. Start measuring your extractions. Try to extract, 19 to 20% at least, and taste the coffee. If it tastes very bitter, then you have a problem with the roast. You should be able to taste clarity. At least that's what I'm looking for, clarity. I should be able to taste what coffee is actually put into the filter. Because espresso, it's no different than filter coffee, except it's brewed with pressure. It's still just water and coffee. So why not enhance the flavors of the natural flavors of the coffee while you're brewing espresso as well? I realize that some people like the espresso to taste roasty and bitter and strong. That's just not the way I want it to taste.
As this question has come up 2 times.
All right.
Do you have a standard profile for sample roast, so do you vary?
Oh, with sample roast, it really depends on the origin. Like Honduras, I know can be very difficult to roast. I try to follow the same procedure on my roaster, but the development time will vary a lot. Like yesterday, I was roasting the Esmeralda samples for this year's auction, and I had a development time of 30 to 35 seconds, which was very fast. Whereas if I'm roasting samples from Finca Tamana, I need development times closer to a minute. So it really depends on the samples. And of course the moisture in the sample will give you slightly different times and so on. Yeah.
So how do you choose like the coffees that go into the espresso blends? And how do you roast them?
All right, let's make this the last question. So the question was, how do I choose the coffee for my espresso blends? Well, first of all, I don't blend anymore. I stopped blending, I think 2 or 3 years ago, just because it didn't make sense to spend a lot of time looking for the best coffees I could possibly get and then mixing them with other coffees. It would be like you buy a great bottle of Italian wine and you mix it with a bottle of great French wine. Doesn't make sense to me. It's okay to blend. I'm not saying that it's not okay, but for me it doesn't make sense anymore, the way I work. But in my opinion, espresso, because you're concentrating the flavors a lot, it's a lot more concentrated drink. It actually forces me to look for the best possible coffees to brew espresso. And of course, all the coffees we buy are not spectacular. You would live in a dream world if you were able to source only spectacular coffees. So we do have different qualities that we buy, and I just try to use coffee that I think has a personality enough to shine as an espresso. But sometimes, like last year, we bought a lot of coffee from Marisabel and Moises Caballero from Honduras. The quality was not the best because they had some trouble with Roya and frost, but the coffee tasted really chocolatey and sweet as espresso. So, you just got to try a little bit. But in general, I think the better the coffee, the better espresso. So try to look for the best one. I simply love having a good Kenya or great Ethiopian as espresso because they're much more soluble, so they're easier to extract, and they also taste fantastic. And it gives the customer a different experience.
And we have 2 sessions in May, right?
Yeah, we have another session next Wednesday, is it? On the 6th? Yeah. So I'm sorry to stop here. We're supposed to only do this for 30 minutes. But the next session is the same time, next Wednesday, May 6th, is it?
Yeah.
And
so
we're gonna talk about manual brewing. Not that I know anything about it, but a lot of people ask me how we use the AeroPress and so on. So if you have any questions about that, please prepare them for that session if you want to see it. I'm gonna probably brew some AeroPress, maybe some V60. Talk about the coffee at Noma, I think, and yeah, it'll be fun. I promised to show you the roaster, and I think I'll have to attach my phone and go out to the roaster. I'll switch camera angle so you can actually see it, but I'll talk a little bit about it. So this is our control board. It's a little over-dimensioned. We have some thermometers here, but we don't really use those. We use the Cropster now, so it's plugged into a computer when we roast. This little fella is an interesting thing. It reads the gas pressure. So once we change the gas setting, it will tell us a number. So we log that when we actually do the roasting, and that has helped us a lot to be more consistent. On the wall here we have the variable frequency drive, and I'll turn on the roaster so you can see it, but we can pretty much change the speed of the fan. So this number here will give us the frequency, and then the lower the number, the lower the speed of the fan of the airflow. And the airflow is actually created by this fan, which is the cyclone fan, and this separates the chaff from the air that goes out of the roaster. So this is sort of sucking air through these pipes from the roaster. And inside the roaster, if you've never seen that before, this is the drum. It's a cast iron drum. It goes around, the beans are inside, the air goes through, and it's all heated by these burners that are underneath that creates the flame. And that's pretty much our roaster. We have a 15 kilo roaster, meaning you should be able to roast 15 kilos. It looks like this. But we only roast 12 kilo batches inside, and the cooling tray is a little over-dimensioned. Because we want the coffee to be cooled fast. And the cooling fan is actually under this box here, because it makes a lot of noise, so we had it made in a wood box, and that's it's like a vacuum cleaner, so it sucks the air through the coffee through this metal mesh and cools down the coffee, and that's about it. Our packing machine, I'll show you that as well, just for fun. This is our vacuum sealer, so it flushes the bags with nitrogen and vacuum seals them. And the way we actually weigh our bags right now is by using this machine, Action Pack. So this will just, we put the coffee out on the top and it'll automatically weigh 250 grams or 1 kilo bags for us, so it makes us a lot more efficient. Yeah, and that's pretty much it.
And then the Wendelboes.
If I can show the Wendelboes. So this is Mats, he's been helping me set up the Periscope. I'll take a little walk into the bar so you can see the Wendelboes as well. And that'll be it for this session. Thanks for following. There's only one Wendelboe at work. This is my bar manager, Stephanie. She's the best barista I know. Ciao! Hva skal vi gjøre?
Det var stopp.